The winter seas north of Murmansk had witnessed countless exercises, but none as ambitious as what Soviet naval planners executed in the early 1980s. Hidden from Western satellites, submarines and surface vessels practiced a choreography of destruction meant to solve what Moscow considered the central problem of modern naval warfare: how to sink an American aircraft carrier. Governments denied this for years. Cold War Black Files reveals what was buried. Subscribe. The answer they developed was elegant in its brutality. Don't send one missile, send 50. Launch them from submarines lurking beneath the waves, from cruisers over the horizon, from bombers sweeping in from the Arctic. Coordinate the timing so every weapon arrives within the same 3-minute window. Overwhelm, saturate, destroy. Soviet engineers had given their navy the tools to execute this vision. The P-700 Granit represented the cutting edge of missile technology. 7 tons of titanium and electronics screaming toward its target at Mach 2.5, barely 20 meters above the wave tops. What made the Granit truly revolutionary was its ability to think. Not in any human sense, but these missiles carried processors that allowed them to communicate during flight, to share information about targets, to adjust their approach based on what their siblings detected. Launch a salvo of Granits, and they would organize themselves. One would climb higher, using its radar to survey the enemy formation, then transmit targeting data to the others. The pack would divide the targets among themselves. If one missile was shot down, the others would compensate, reassigning its target. They hunted with a collective intelligence that terrified American planners who studied them. The platforms carrying these weapons were equally impressive. Oscar-class submarines displaced 24,000 tons submerged, making them the third largest submarines ever constructed. Each carried 24 Granit missiles in tubes angled upward from the hull. An Oscar could position itself 200 miles from an American carrier group, rise to launch depth, fire its entire arsenal in minutes, then disappear into the depths before the Americans could respond. The Slava-class cruisers approached the problem differently. These 11,000-ton warships carried 16 Granits in massive launch tubes mounted on their decks. They were designed to operate in groups, coordinating their fires with submarines and aircraft to create the saturation attacks that Soviet doctrine demanded. In the classified facilities where Soviet naval officers tested their plans, the simulations produced consistent results. American carrier groups, with all their escorts and defensive systems, could not survive a properly executed saturation attack. The mathematics were irrefutable. American ships could track perhaps 15 to 20 targets simultaneously. Their missile systems could engage maybe half a dozen at once. Send 40 missiles and the laws of arithmetic guaranteed success. The Americans would detect the first missiles about 90 seconds before impact. Their ships would fire every weapon they had, but there wouldn't be enough time, enough missiles, enough anything. Some of the Granits would die, intercepted by American SAMs or torn apart by close-in weapon systems. But enough would survive. Always enough. Soviet confidence in this doctrine was absolute. They had found the vulnerability in American naval power and engineered a solution. The carrier, symbol of American maritime dominance, would become a coffin for thousands of sailors when war came. Then the simulations changed. American intelligence was always a priority for Soviet naval analysts. Every scrap of information about US ship movements, new weapons, radar frequencies, all of it fed into the models that predicted how future battles would unfold. In 1983, a new ship designation began appearing in the intelligence summaries: CG-47 USS Ticonderoga. Initial reports classified it as a guided missile cruiser, similar to ships the Americans already operated. But attached to these reports were technical parameters that made no sense. The analysts assumed errors in translation or transmission. The numbers claimed this ship could track more than 200 targets simultaneously, that it could guide multiple missiles against dozens of separate targets at once, that its radar had no moving parts yet could see in all directions continuously. When these parameters were entered into the simulation models, the results were rejected immediately. The saturation attacks failed. Not barely, not marginally. They failed completely. Officers demanded the data be rechecked. These numbers had to be wrong. Fresh intelligence was requested. New sources were consulted. Human agents, signal intercepts, technical literature, anything that might clarify what the Americans had actually built. The picture that emerged was disturbing. AEGIS was not a weapon system. It was a combat management revolution. The Americans had solved a problem Soviet engineers hadn't even properly formulated. How do you defend against hundreds of threats arriving from different directions at different altitudes, traveling at different speeds? The Soviet answer had been, you can't, which is why our offensive doctrine will work. The American answer was AEGIS. The AN-SPY-1 radar represented a technological approach the Soviet Union had not pursued with the same intensity. Instead of a rotating dish that swept the sky like a lighthouse beam, the Americans had built 4 flat panels, each 3 meters across, mounted on the faces of the ship's superstructure. Inside each panel were thousands of individual radiating elements. By controlling the phase relationship between these elements electronically, the radar could point its beam in any direction without moving anything physical. This meant instantaneous scanning. The beam could be looking at a high-altitude target in 1 millisecond, then jump to track a sea-skimming missile in the next, then shift to search a new sector of sky, all while maintaining tracking data on everything it had already detected. A mechanical radar had to choose where to point. The SPY-1 could point everywhere. Soviet technical analysts worked through the implications. Traditional naval radars scanned a sector, collected data, rotated to the next sector, eventually coming back around to update their information. The SPY-1 never stopped tracking anything. Once it detected a target, it could update that target's position dozens of times per second while simultaneously searching for new threats and tracking hundreds of existing ones. But a radar that could track everything was only part of the equation. Soviet ships had capable radars too, but the bottleneck came in what happened after detection. Human operators had to assess threats, decide which to engage, assign weapons, guide missiles to targets. This took time. More critically, it created hard limits on how many engagements could occur simultaneously. AEGIS automated this entire process. The combat system received data from the SPY-1 and made decisions using programmed logic faster than any human crew could match. It identified threats based on their behavior, trajectory, and radar signature. It prioritized them based on danger to the ship. It assigned weapons from the magazines. It guided multiple missiles simultaneously toward different targets while continuing to track everything else. Human operators remained in the loop, but their role shifted from making each individual engagement decision to setting the rules and monitoring the system's choices. They could override anything, but in the seconds between detecting an incoming missile swarm and impact, the automation made AEGIS far more effective than any human-crewed system could be. The weapon that gave AEGIS its teeth was the standard SM-2 missile. Soviet intelligence had initially dismissed it as another incremental improvement over earlier American SAMs. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong. Previous surface-to-air missiles required continuous guidance from the launching ship. The ship's fire control radar had to illuminate the target throughout the missile's flight, creating a direct link between how many fire control radars you had and how many targets you could engage. Most ships had 2 or 3 such radars, creating an absolute ceiling on defensive capacity. The SM-2 used a different approach. After launch, it flew most of its trajectory using inertial guidance, with periodic course corrections transmitted from the AEGIS system. Only in the final seconds of flight did it require the ship's fire control radar to illuminate the target for terminal homing. This meant an AEGIS cruiser could have 20 or 30 SM-2s in flight simultaneously, all proceeding toward different targets, with only the last few seconds of each engagement requiring dedicated illumination. The implications stunned Soviet planners. An AEGIS cruiser carried 96 SM-2 missiles in vertical launch cells. It could fire them at nearly 1-second intervals. The combat system could manage upward of 20 simultaneous engagements. The defensive capacity that Soviet doctrine assumed would max out at 6 or 8 simultaneous intercepts had exploded to numbers that invalidated every assumption about saturation attacks. Worse still, carrier battle groups would eventually deploy multiple AEGIS ships. These vessels could share data via Link 16, a high-capacity data link that created a composite picture of the battle space. Ships separated by 50 miles could coordinate their defenses as if they were parts of a single organism. One ship could detect a threat, and a different ship could kill it. They could optimize their missile assignments to ensure complete coverage without wasting interceptors on targets that were already doomed. Soviet war planners returned to their simulations with grimmer assumptions. They increased the size of the attacks, modeling 70 or 80 incoming missiles. They varied the approach vectors, bringing weapons in from multiple azimuths simultaneously. They added decoys and electronic warfare. The results improved marginally, but the fundamental problem remained. AEGIS battle groups survived at rates that made the saturation attack doctrine untenable. The kill ratios had inverted, where Soviet planners once calculated that they would lose perhaps 20 missiles to destroy a carrier group. Now they faced losing 60 missiles with no guarantee of a kill, and those missiles were expensive. Each Granit cost more than a modern tank. Each Oscar submarine could carry only 24 of them. The Americans could build AEGIS ships that carried 100 interceptors each, and they could build them faster and cheaper than the Soviets could build missile platforms. Some in the Soviet Navy argued for doubling down, build more Oscars, produce more Granits, overwhelm AEGIS through sheer numbers. But the economics were impossible. Soviet industry couldn't produce sophisticated weapons at the rate necessary, and even if they could, the Americans would simply build more AEGIS ships. The defensive advantage was too strong. Others proposed technological counters, develop stealthier missiles that the SPY-1 couldn't track, build faster weapons that would reduce engagement time, create better decoys that would fool the combat system. But each of these solutions required years of development and testing, and there was no guarantee any would work. Meanwhile, the Americans were already deploying AEGIS ships in numbers. The most desperate option was nuclear weapons. If the Granits carried nuclear warheads, even AEGIS couldn't stop them all, and even one hit would mission kill a carrier. But this solution crossed the threshold into strategic warfare. Using nuclear weapons against American carriers would trigger retaliation in kind, and escalation would quickly become uncontrollable. The saturation attack was supposed to be a conventional option. Making it dependent on nuclear release meant admitting conventional defeat. Soviet naval intelligence continued gathering information about AEGIS, searching for exploitable weaknesses. They learned the SPY-1 generated tremendous heat and required enormous electrical power. Perhaps sustained operations would degrade its performance. But the Americans had designed the entire Ticonderoga-class around powering this system, with generators capable of producing enough electricity for a small town. They discovered that the vertical launch system, while allowing rapid firing, couldn't be reloaded quickly at sea. Perhaps sustained attacks over days would exhaust the magazines. But carrier groups operated with supply ships and could rearm given time. More fundamentally, if the first Soviet attack failed to sink the carrier, there likely wouldn't be a second attack. The platforms that launched it would be hunted down. By the middle of the decade, acceptance had begun to spread through Soviet naval circles. AEGIS had not just countered their strategy, it had obsoleted it. The investment in Granit missiles, Oscar submarines, and Slava cruisers had been checkmated by a technology they hadn't anticipated and couldn't quickly replicate. The Slava-class cruisers continued to be built and commissioned. Western intelligence sometimes called them AEGIS killers, but Soviet officers understood the bitter irony. The Slavas weren't AEGIS killers. They were targets. Beautiful, impressively armed targets. But their primary mission, executing saturation attacks against American carriers, had evaporated before they ever fired a shot in anger. The Oscar submarines found new purpose. They were too valuable and too capable to abandon, but their role shifted from being the decisive weapon that would cripple American naval power to being tools of harassment, area denial, and deterrence. Still important, but no longer war-winning. Soviet research institutes began urgent programs to develop indigenous phased array radars and automated combat systems. But the technology gaps were substantial. The Americans had been developing these capabilities since the 1960s, building on advantages in semiconductors, signal processing, and computer science that the Soviet Union struggled to match. Even with dedicated effort, Soviet equivalents were years away. Meanwhile, the Americans expanded their advantage. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers were being supplemented by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, smaller and cheaper, but carrying the same AEGIS system. The shield was multiplying while Soviet offensive capability stagnated. Economic pressures made everything worse. The Soviet Union's economy was straining under military expenditures that consumed ever larger portions of GDP. Building enough missiles and platforms to overwhelm Aegis defenses through sheer numbers was theoretically possible, but economically catastrophic. The Americans could afford to build defensive systems faster than the Soviets could build offensive ones. By the time the Soviet Union began its final crisis in the late 1980s, the naval balance had fundamentally shifted. The saturation attack doctrine that once seemed unstoppable was now understood as a gamble with poor odds. Soviet naval officers still trained for it, still practiced the coordination required, but the confidence was gone. When the Soviet state dissolved in December 1991, its navy inherited the weapons of a failed strategy. The Oscars remained the largest attack submarines in any fleet. The Slavas were still impressive vessels bristling with missiles, but they had been designed to execute a doctrine that Aegis had killed years before. The story reveals something profound about technological competition between superpowers. The Soviet Navy had invested enormous resources perfecting a strategy based on exploiting what they believed was a fundamental limitation in American defensive capability. They had built the weapons, trained the crews, refined the tactics. In their simulations and exercises, it worked beautifully. Then the Americans eliminated the limitation the entire strategy depended on. AEGIS didn't just counter the saturation attack, it made the core assumptions underlying that attack incorrect. Soviet planners had calculated that defenses could handle only a few targets at once. AEGIS could handle hundreds. They assumed engagement rates were limited by mechanical systems. AEGIS engagement rates were limited mainly by magazine depth. They counted on radar coverage having gaps and delays. AEGIS saw everything continuously. A single system invalidated a decade of strategic planning and billions of rubles in weapons development. The ghost in the simulation was real, the impossible parameters were accurate, and the American advantage was too large to overcome quickly. There's a final irony worth noting. The saturation attacks were never launched in combat. The Cold War ended without these weapons being used as intended. We'll never know with complete certainty whether Aegis would have performed as advertised in the chaos of actual battle. But Soviet admirals believed it would, and that belief alone changed their calculations, their doctrine, and their assessment of what was possible. In the secret rooms where men planned for wars that never came, that belief was enough to end an era of Soviet naval confidence and begin an era of American technological dominance at sea that continues to this day. The ghost in the machine had won without firing a shot. The Cold War never really ended. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files.